Rob is an anti-Zionist campaigner, Jewish anti-Zionist. He's written this pamphlet that's available at the bookmarks. And he's going to introduce the meeting for about half an hour. Everyone's very familiar with the format, and there'll be plenty of time for contributions and discussion. And hand over to you, Rob.
Today, on the 7th of July 1944, the last trains of Hungarian Jews were leaving Hungary. Over just 10 weeks, 434,000 Jews were transported from Hungary to the gates of the crematoria of Auschwitz. It was the most intense killing period of the entire final solution. 75% of Hungarian Jewry perished, including members of my mother's family. Today, as we meet, a fascist party with roots going back to the regime that deported French Jews to the death camps stands to emerge as the largest party in the second round of the French elections. It is a party imbued with anti-Semitic ideology, yet has been allowed to adopt a mantle of respectability. I wish to argue that anti-Semitism is not simply a historic phenomenon or confined to the margins of the racist worldview. It is an increasingly prevalent element of right-wing ideology across the globe. It needs to be understood, explained, and fought. Across Europe and North America, fascists, the far right, and the right-wing mainstream parties cast a globalist elite as engineers of economic crisis, as powerful forces eroding national identity, of encouraging a tide of Muslim invaders and migrants, undermining the family, promoting gender ideology, trans rights, and LGBTQ rights and feminism. They may avoid explicit reference to Jews as Jews, although some certainly do. Rather, they personalize Jewry in the form of individuals, most notably the ubiquitous figure of the Jewish financier George Soros. They will constantly vent against globalists and globalist interests, dog whistle surrogates, these are, for international Jewry and cosmopolitans without loyalty to country or nation. It's important to grasp the extent and global scale of rising anti-Semitism. I want to start with the example of Hungary itself. You see, Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary for 14 years and head of government, is an international icon of the far right. Under the banner of illiberal democracy, he has forged a toxic brand of anti-Semitism, anti-migrant racism, LGBTQ hate, all underpinned by hostility to global elites. Hungary is a sponsor of key gatherings of the far right internationally that act as a bridge between right-wing conservatives, far-right populists, and outright fascists. Orban combines attacks on globalist financial interests with racist rhetoric of a migrant invasion. During the 2018 election campaign, the slogans "Stop Soros" and "Stop the Soros Plan" were the centerpiece slogans of the campaign. In front of 100,000 crowd, Orban declares Hungary faces an opponent whose grand plan is, I quote, to dilute the population of Europe and to replace it, to cast aside our culture and our way of life. The drumbeat is of the impending threat to European civilization, national identity, the family, and national sovereignty. And this is the ideology of great replacement conspiracy theory. It's an ideology that runs through the entire far right. Rassemblement National, the AfD, Finns Party, Brothers of Italy, Swiss People's Party, Vox in Spain, and so on. Vox President Abascal. Soros is redoubling his efforts to favour the Islamization of Europe and chaos in the continent. President Sanchez, the Socialist Party, is at his command. Jörg Orban, leader of the AfD in Saxony. George Soros has a clear political agenda: the abolition of nation states and the dissolution of cultures. Jaroslaw Kaczynski, leader of the Polish Law and Justice Party, claims Soros is encouraging refugees who seek to impose Sharia law and turn churches into toilets, to undermine national identity and manipulate the populations of Europe for profit. Marine Le Pen, while claiming not to believe in the great replacement theory, constantly employs the same references. She speaks, for example, of a global elite whose goal is the new man, severed from his roots, nomadic, dispensable, a slave to the market. Trade unions, she says, have surrendered to the bank, by which she means the Jewish bank. Nigel Farage is one of the most persistent in attacking Soros. It's not actually given the coverage. In Newsweek, Farage declares we are in the midst of the great political battle of our time. Globalism versus nationalism. Soros, he says, is flooding Europe to undermine democracy and to fundamentally change the makeup, demographically, of the whole continent. Soros is the biggest danger to the entire Western world. And he accuses Soros of funding professional, hard-left protesters, including Black Lives Matter, Stand Up to Racism, big clap, and of course, unions and student protests. This is an ideology that sees in every enemy within the hand of a malign global foe. Then there is the United States. In November, it's likely we will face the election of a US president who defended white supremacists and neo-Nazis at Charlottesville, shouting, "The Jews shall not replace us," as very fine people. During the 2018 midterm elections, vilification of Soros saturated the Republican campaign. Accusations of Soros, above all, financing migrant caravans and buying the election. In the final 2 weeks, pipe bombs are mailed to Soros, Clinton, Obama, CNN and others by a white supremacist who believed whites had to, I quote, take back the world. A neo-Nazi, Robert Bowers, broke into the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, murdering 11 Jews. The synagogue was affiliated to HIAS, a Jewish refugee aid organization. On his blog, Bowers posted, "HIAS brings invaders in that kill our people. I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Screw your optics, I'm going in." Great Replacement conspiracy theory marks the manifestos and profiles of all the white supremacist mass killers, from Anders Breivik in Norway, who slaughtered 60 at a socialist youth camp in 2011, Dylan Roof, the killers of Christchurch in New Zealand, Halle in Germany, Escondido and Poway in California, El Paso, Colorado Springs, I can go on. Their victims, a socialist youth camp, Muslims, Jews, an LGBTQ bar, blacks, Hispanic shoppers, and a Walmart. Great Replacement theory acts as a frame in which every foe presents another front in an existential battle to defend national identity. Far-right politicians will try, of course, to disown them, but these explosions of fascist terror are rooted in shared ideological terrain. They are what I would call the outriders of the fascist violence, of organised fascist violence, the lone outriders. What then of the fascist parties such as Rassemblement National or the Brothers of Italy? You see, their respectable electoral front appears very different from the killers of Pittsburgh and Poway. Take Marine Le Pen. Since 2011, she has promoted the detoxification or demonisation of the party, above all expunging public expressions of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. But anti-Semitism is very much part still of her and her party's worldview. The constant coded references to Great Replacement, the refusal to condemn the Vichy regime or French Nazi collaborators, denying French state responsibility for sending 13,000 French Jews to the death camps. Meloni in Italy has promoted the same agenda. Last week, however, her party was rocked by the exposure of anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial and adulation of Mussolini and Hitler rife in the party's youth wing. And this dual character is common to all these fascist parties. On the one hand, they need to promote a respectable electoral front to widen their popular base, but on the other, they need to send a message to their fascist hardcore. And this is not unique to contemporary fascism. In decisive elections in the 30s, the Nazis gave anti-Semitism actually quite a low profile. In Hitler's programme as candidate for the election of the Reichspräsident in 1932, anti-Semitism and Jews weren't mentioned. Nonetheless, anti-Semitism is not simply an add-on prejudice. Far-right populists like Orban and Farage need to present themselves as separate from and in opposition to the establishment and the elite. For the fascists, just attacking migrants, toxic and violent though it is, doesn't quite do that. For the fascists, there's an additional impulse. Fascism is not ultimately about elections. Fascists aim to mobilise forces of mass violence from below. They code their anti-Semitism enough so as not to put up a barrier to building a wider base, but still preserve the terrain for the Nazi hardcore, for whom anti-Semitism serves as an ideological driver for the fascist project. Fascism requires, I think what Mark called earlier, a pseudo-revolutionary language, a pseudo-revolutionary ideology. It can tone it down, it can't dispense with it. And finally, Israel in the equation. You see, the fascist parties see Israel as an exclusionary, ethno-nationalist project they can share common cause with against Islam and Muslims. And also, I think it's important to register that Israel is tied to European imperialism. This factor did not exist in the 1930s. So we have a coding, the rootless, cosmopolitan, international Jew against the real Jew, the tribunes of their own fortress settler colonial state. Anti-Semitism is an ideology that constructs imaginary foes. It does not even require their existence, or their presence, should I say. The Jewish population of Germany before the Holocaust in 1933 was less than 0.75%. In Hungary and Poland, far-right governments talk of an Islamic invasion. The Muslim population of Hungary is 0.4%. Poland, 0.1%. Before the Ukraine war, Hungary had less than 6,000 refugees out of a population of 10 million. Poland, less than 5,000 out of a population of 36 million. The foes may be imaginary, the victims are not. I've talked about anti-Semitism today, but I want to spend a bit of time rooting modern anti-Semitism as an ideology of reaction that's rooted in capitalism. It emerges in its fully developed modern form in the late 19th century. This is the period of the rise of rival nation states, of economic crisis, the first great economic crisis of the 1870s, colonialism, and the rise of the working class, socialist and revolutionary movements. Anti-Semitism isn't just a scapegoat. It has an explanatory power, and it speaks to the despair and rage at the ruin brought about by seemingly incomprehensible forces, and it serves to mobilize counter-revolution. Anti-Semitism fueled reaction and counter-revolution from the pogroms in Tsarist Russia of the 1880s through to the Nazi Holocaust. And anti-Semitism provides the ideological steel for the Nazi hardcore. And today, this ideology has returned in narratives directed against malign globalists as the hidden hand behind migrant invaders, BLM protesters, advocates of gender ideology, in quotes, and anti-Semitic notions of cultural Marxism are normalised by mainstream conservative politicians as part of their culture wars. And it finds a gateway too in anti-vax and COVID conspiracy theories and anti-trans prejudice and so on. We do not face a threat on the scale of the anti-Semitic and fascist movements of the 20th century, but we should not underestimate its role as the far right rise. I want to just spend some time on the attacks on the left, because I think this frames a lot of the context in which probably people come to this meeting. So I want to just turn to the weaponised charges of anti-Semitism against the left and anti-imperialist movement. In the UK, this began in late 2015 with the election of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party. Now, important though that is, it can distort our view of the roots of the narrative itself. The current wave of this ideological attack emerges earlier, in the early mid-2000s, aimed at radical Islam and Muslim populations. This is the period of the Second Intifada, 9/11, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the emergence of mass anti-war movements that raised the slogan of the Free Palestine. A founding influential text penned in 2002 by French philosopher Pierre-André Tardieu, translated in English as Rising from the Muck, the New Anti-Semitism in Europe. He argues that Islamism is a global peril, that Palestinians are standard bearers for the enemies of democracy and the West, above all Maghrebian and African youth from the banlieue on the outskirts of French cities. A red-green alliance of Islamists and the left, united by anti-capitalism, anti-Americanism and authoritarian ideology. And the Islamophobic toxicity is difficult to overstate. Yehuda Bauer, historian, important authority on the Holocaust, pointed to the 20 million Muslim immigrants in Europe, arguing that radical religious belief is their only way of gaining some self-esteem and feeling of identity. The new anti-Semitism, he claimed, is a genocidal threat to universalist civilization, embodied in Western democracy. And so the narrative thus becomes a cornerstone of something wider. We see it in the repression of the student encampments in the US, in the relentless attacks by the German state, mirrored in bans and police repression across Europe. So Corbyn was an important milestone, but it was not the starting point and clearly not the end. And the early, first origins of the narrative lie in the aftermath of the Arab-Israeli wars of 1967 and 73. This was a period when the May 68 youth and student risings, the general strike in France, herald a wave of global revolt. The US faced defeat in Vietnam, a rising mass anti-war movement, black uprisings in the US cities, the rise of black power and a new left, and radical movements for women and gay liberation. And in May '68, over 30 campuses hosted Palestinian Week across the United States. At Berkeley, Marxist scholar Hal Draper debated with left-wing writer Paul Jacobs on Zionism and socialism. And all this amidst a wave of campus teachings, protests, strikes in opposition to the Vietnam War. And at this point, moderate civil rights activists such as the NAACP, Bayard Rustin, wanted to construct a firewall against the radicals of black power. And liberals wanted who wanted a negotiated end to the war on Vietnam on America's terms, wanted to drive a wedge against the anti-imperialist left. They sought to draw a line in the sand between acceptable left liberal dissent and an anti-systemic, anti-imperialist revolutionary politics. Norman Podhoretz, a former Liberal Democrat, later a prominent neocon, declared the values and institutions of the liberal democratic order are at stake. So the narrative of the new anti-Semitism is of course a defence of the State of Israel. But it is in its defence of the US state and Western imperialist order that lays its foundations. What is so toxic about it is that it degrades the very meaning of anti-Semitism. The conflation of anti-Semitism with resistance to oppression gives every fascist a get-out-of-jail-free card. They can fuel great replacement, conspiracy theory, vilify Soros and Jewish finance, rehabilitate collaborationist regimes of the Nazi era. Anti-Semitic? Moi? I support Israel. No, the real anti-Semites are the Muslims and the left. So we have today, literally today, French Jewish figures, prominent ones, such as Alain Finkielkraut and the former Nazi hunter Serge Klarsfeld, declare that given a choice between the left and the RN, they will vote for the fascists. So the new anti-Semitism narrative acts as a shield for state Islamophobia and racism and enables them to hurl the charge of racism back at the left, and it divides the forces and undermines the unity that's so vital to defeating the fascists and the far right. I want to conclude with how the left should respond. First, some problematic responses. You see, how do we understand anti-Semitism and the position of Jews in society today? You see, there is an argument that anti-Semitism is nasty, but marginal. Even that it is not racism, but a form of personal prejudice and bigotry that somehow sort of hangs in the air. I think this idea was reflected in part in the letter that Diane Abbott sent to The Guardian, and which Starmer used as an excuse to suspend her. Look, you see, the premise is that Jews are not subject to institutional racism in employment, education, or to police and state violence in the same way as black people or Muslims. Now this is true, although there is a caveat if you consider the position of some ultra-Orthodox communities in parts of London and elsewhere and so forth. But importantly, it misunderstands racism as a social construct. Yes, racism takes the form of institutional racism and state oppression. This affects every aspect of life of black, Muslim, Asian people. They are material outcomes of racist ideology. But it is not the only material form of racist ideology. You see, the Jewish populations of Budapest, of Vienna, Paris, Berlin, in the late 19th and early 20th century, were not in the main drawn from poorer society. The tribunes of modern anti-Semitism, Karl Lueger in Vienna, Wilhelm Marr in Germany, Edward Drummond in France, targeted well-to-do, assimilated, urban Jewish populations. Prime example is the Dreyfus trial in France. Lugar railed against the disproportionate number of Jews in the civil service, law and medical professions. The Jewish population of Hungary in 1919 was 5%. The proportion of Jewish students in universities was 36%. That's a privileged domain in the early 20th century. And the first anti-Semitic legislation in Europe after World War I was the Hungarian numerus clausus imposing quotas on university places for Jews. Wind the clock forward, 6 million dead in the final solution, 75% of Hungarian Jewry wiped out in 10 weeks. Institutional racism is a material outcome of racist ideology. So is Auschwitz. Some voices have taken this argument into the realms of anti-Semitism, I have to say, arguing that Jews have disproportionate power in society and conflating Zionism with Jewry per se. Echoing the founders of anti-Semitism, they spuriously point to the facts of so-called Jewish power. And this has to be just called out for what it is. And I think a second problem can arise over the issue of the Zionist lobby. Now, the Zionist lobby exists. Israel, its Ministry of Strategic Affairs, its embassies, the pro-Zionist camp devote huge resources to silence criticism of Israel. However, the real engine lies somewhere else. From the Balfour Declaration by Britain to US support for Israel since the '67 Arab-Israeli War, AIPAC was a shoestring operation until the 1980s, long after US military funding of Israel took off. Sometimes couldn't even pay its own staff. US policy is not driven by the lobby. The biggest spikes in funding come when the Jordanian regime is threatened in 1970, and the biggest spike before now came after the Iranian Revolution of 1979. The trajectory of support for Israel has little to do with the Zionist lobby, but everything to do with US imperialism in the Middle East and beyond. And I think to confuse this can undermine our ability to identify the nature of the enemy. And it can open the door to conspiratorial ideas of Zionist power and a gateway to anti-Semitic ideas. Western politicians, like Keir Starmer, are not bought and paid for. It is the interest of the British state that drives Labour and Starmer's support for Israel, not campaign contributions or free trips. If anything, the latter flows from the former. And there is a danger that in the unremitting attacks on the left, which have been so severe, that the Zionist camp that insists on the affinity with Israel defining the Jewish identity, that a distorted hall of mirrors, some on the left reflect it with memes that conflate Jewish identity with Zionism, or the victims of the Holocaust with the perpetrators, and so on. Now, like every form of racism, anti-Semitism has in the past and can today permeate the left. It has to be challenged wherever it rears its head, whether over Israel or not. However, it is not, as our enemies keep on insisting, somehow a natural consequence generated by anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, and opposition to the ruling class, and so forth. On the contrary, it's a foul reactionary ideology forged precisely as a sword of reaction at the throat of anti-imperialist and socialist movements based on internationalism and working class solidarity. And that reactionary ideology is returning to haunt us. So I'll finish with this. How do we fight against anti-Semitism today? First, by building a united front against the fascists and the far right. By building an international anti-fascist movement. against Le Pen, against Meloni, the AfD, and so forth. And first and foremost, building the demonstration against the Nazi Tommy Robinson on the 27th of July. To identify their anti-Semitism and the faith-coded forms for what they are, and call them out. And importantly, though, more than that, to explain its function, to not only as hatred of Jews, which it is, but to mobilise hate and violence against Muslim, black, trans, LGBT+, women and Roma. And when I say confront, I mean confront, literally confront. You see, during the 1970s, when the anti-Nazi League confronted the fascist demonstrations, those demonstrations included hardcore Nazis, softer elements, soft racists and so on. In confronting them, the hardcore come to the front of the demo with all their bile and all their poison, and you start to begin to expose them, both to some on the marches, but also importantly to wider society, some of whom might be pulled by fascist politics and propaganda and so on. So this is the most important task facing the left and the anti-racist movement today. The fascists and the far right use anti-Semitism as a weapon against every target and foe. And we have to fight them with a united fist. Second, to build the anti-imperialist movements. You see, fascism emerged in a Europe of crisis and war. We concede to our rulers war drives at our peril. And this means now, first of all, building the movement over Palestine, but also against the war in Ukraine, also against the marshalling of military forces in the South Asia Seas, and so forth. And in the struggle against oppression, a new vision can be born. The two things aren't separate. First we resist oppression, and then we move on to talk about the future. That's not how it works. One of the most inspiring elements of the mass movement over Palestine are the encampments in the US, and to see the radical Jewish tradition being reforged by a new generation of young Jewish students, developing an alternative vision of fighting oppression, anti-Semitism, and the right to that of some mythical refuge in an exclusionary settler colonial state. And finally, hope. The rise of far-right and fascist parties in Europe are not distinct national phenomena. They are rooted in a common European crisis. We must pose an answer to that crisis through building working-class resistance and struggle, but also by forging unity and breaking down division. And for that, we need a revolutionary vision. A vision that can only be realised by revolutionary practice in the struggles we face today. That means building organisation, revolutionary organisation. Anti-Semitism is on the rise again because it is born of a system of warring capitalist states, of racism, exploitation and crisis, and we must end it.
Yiddishkeit and the diasporic, let's say, Judaism that was promoted in Europe, or that was central in Europe before the Holocaust and before the proliferation of Zionism, has been both clarifying on a personal level, but also supremely on a political level. And when we look at the basis of anti-Semitism, I think in being able to fight anti-Semitism, first of all, we need to be clear on the root causes, as was just discussed by the speaker, and that being grounded in capitalist and economic discrimination and causes, in capitalist causes in that respect. And then also, which I think the comrade spoke about, that the underlying thread of anti-Semitism wasn't just being a scapegoat, but was also utilizing this demonization and dehumanization of Jewish people to oppress other people. And we see that, I mean, from Herzl, I have this quote that I always read, which is by ridding Western Europe of the disquieting, unpredictable, and inevitable rivalry of a Jewish proletariat, Jews could better protect themselves from anti-Semitism by passing it on to another economically disadvantaged group. And this was part of the original basis for Zionism and why they wanted all the Jews out of Europe into the Middle East. So it was always a mechanism for oppressing other people, and we see that now clearer than ever in the way that it's being used to oppress our Muslim and Arab and Palestinian siblings. And I also just want to, I'm coming from Germany, I'm American, but coming from the German context where I've been for 5 years, organized there, and very active in the anti-fascism as well as the Palestine Solidarity movement. And the hypocrisy is so stark. I'll give a short anecdote. In the past year, or 6 months ago or so, we were at an anti-fascism, anti-AfD demo. I was there with a sign that said, Jew against the AfD, fascism and Zionism for a free Palestine. And I had a few, not many, but I had a few Germans coming up to me who were there supposedly to fight fascism, came up to me, insulted me, told me that insulted my grandmother who was a Holocaust survivor, told me to fuck off and spat in my face for standing against the genocide and for standing against Zionism. And this is because of this equation between Judaism and Zionism that we all, I think in this room, are very familiar with. But in order to be able to fight those accusations of anti-Semitism, which of course are completely baseless within the Palestine movement, we also need to be armed with the knowledge that at the root of Zionism is anti-Semitism. And at the root of the way that Palestinians and Arabs and also leftist Jews are being demonized and criminalized, particularly in Germany, is anti-Semitism, but it's also an extension of anti-Muslim and anti-Palestinian racism. So in that respect, I think arming ourselves with the knowledge of the root causes is the only way to really fight anti-Semitism. And what I'll just end with is kind of a line that I've been ruminating on a little bit, is really by looking to the past and to the Yiddishkeit of the past, we will be able to arm ourselves with a Judaism from the past of an anti-Zionist radical Jewish tradition in order to recreate this anti-racist, anti-Zionist, and radical Jewish tradition of the future. Thank you.
What the role of anti-Semitism is for the hard right. And let's face it, it's the right where real anti-Semitism comes from. Eric K. Ward is an American civil rights academic. And he had the lovely job of going around to speak to all the white supremacist organisations in America. And he, at the end of this, he came to a conclusion. He wrote in an article called Skin in the Game. He said, we will never have black liberation until we smash anti-Semitism. It is the glue that keeps the far right together. Why? I mean, Rob alluded to it, mentioned it. You cannot look at someone getting off a boat with nothing and say they are the problem. Yes, you can say that it's the main daily bread and butter, Islamophobia, anti-migrant stuff, but they're not the people you can really blame for what's going on. This is where the Jews work. They are the hidden hand. They are the puppet masters. All of that because it's an anti-capitalist veneer that these organisations have, and you can only do that with Jews. So that's the glue. But I just wanted to flesh out a bit more the issues on our side that are arising in our pro-Palestinian WhatsApp groups. Because of course there's a massive frustration because there's a genocide happening from a bunch of people who tell you they are Jewish, that they are fighting for Jewish people, that this is the worst attack since the Holocaust, this is what's coming out of the Zionist mouths, and why would you not, as a young person watching babies being murdered, think you know what the problem is Jews? And actually, this is a tiny minority, I'm not saying this is our movement, but I understand the frustration, and the blurring of the lines happens in a number of ways. Rob talked about the Israeli lobby. There are good people who are more and more talking about the penetration of the Israeli lobby into this country. I'm sorry, there's an oil lobby, massive oil lobbies, hundreds of millions. Do people blame them for us sticking to Britain and the West sticking to oil? No. Capitalism is wedded to oil, therefore they're carrying it. It's not the lobby, it's the dog, the tail wagging the dog. It's the wrong way round completely. When people on the left put a swastika next to the Star of David, what does this do? This A doesn't explain what the colonial settler project is, which is brutal. Colonial settlers wiped out Native Americans, Tasmanians, etc. It's brutal, racist and expansionist. That's what we're talking about. And B, it doesn't actually tell you how to fight fascism, because this is not the same thing, and so it completely undermines us. And the last thing, the minimising of the Holocaust is a real problem, and good people do it, but let's be clear, this does not help the Palestinians. This does not help any of us. We have to unite the working class. We are against all racism, all oppression, because without a united working class, we cannot get rid of this rotten system and actually say never again.
Yeah, I'm almost too much about to say what I was going to say, because Aaron's just said it pretty effectively, but I think I will say it again. I think that, firstly, because I think it bears repeating, and I want to talk about it concretely in terms of you know, the struggle in the place that I live. You see, I think Rob's absolutely right to situate the whole thing. You know, the largest question is the question of the far right. The next question, you know, the question of how it leaches into our side, leaches into the left, is important. And before you say that, you have to say, look at the fantastic number of Jewish people on the marches. Yesterday, for about the 14th time, I marched with my Jewish son-in-law on the march, and it's an invigorating and wonderful thing to do. And we have to point to that. We have to point to the thousands of people. We have to point to the people who are being brought into activity from the Jewish community. Nevertheless, there is a problem, and you said, what's up, Anna? In the small town in Essex in which I live, you know, we've built a few demonstrations, we've done okay, we've got a WhatsApp that coordinates that. Now, time and time again, people post things from social media. It's often people who are not that active, they post things from social media that are really, really problematic, from false friends of the Palestinians. And sometimes it is, you know, openly anti-Semitic stuff, occasionally, very, very rarely, but occasionally it has been, because they haven't looked or listened to it properly. Sometimes it conflates Jews and Zionists, and other times it is stuff about the bloody Israeli lobby. And we've taken the decision that actually we do not let a single one of those stand. Now, WhatsApps are not places for big, long political conversations, but unfortunately we're forced to have them because we do not tolerate the smallest opening for toxic anti-Semitism in that group, because it will poison us and it will poison our ability to resist what is happening in Gaza if we allow it through. So we have long conversations. And what's kind of encouraging about it is that a lot of these people who post stuff like that, you know, they're not terrible people. They're not terrible people. They are heartbroken and angry, and they use the wrong bloody words, and they get some of their ideas mixed up, and we actually have to have quite a patient discussion with them. Now, if somebody insisted on doing it, we'd kick them off the group. We haven't had to do that. We've actually won people round, and actually the atmosphere on that group and our ability to mobilise people has been the better for it. And I couldn't have put the end bit better than how it did, you know, we need unity, we need that unity in order not only to win around Palestine, but to build a bloody decent world for us all.
I'm a dual citizen of both England and Germany. I was born in Germany, and I have a German father who's very pro-Zionist, which is obviously very difficult. I've struggled to communicate with various members of my German family and friends about the issue of Israel and Palestine. My family is very left-wing and socially liberal, but I think a large part of the issue is a long-standing, deep-rooted German guilt. And it seems that even in the face of the brutalities of the Israeli regime, there's a blind spot for many German citizens. In addition, the belief that any criticism of the Israeli regime or Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic, this then waters down the meaning of anti-Semitism both in Germany and worldwide. Given that we've got the rise of the AfD and current problems in France, Germany really risks following France in the footsteps of the rise of fascism, why I believe this is such a significant issue. And my question is, how do we tackle and approach on a personal level the question of German guilt whilst continuing to smash anti-Semitism as and when it arises within our ranks?
First of all, actually, I want to, really thank comrades like Rob and Anna and others who I think have helped clarify and arm and give confidence to us to deal with what are often quite challenging and complicated arguments. I think the organisation feels confident around it. Second thing I want to say, you see, there used to be a programme on Channel 4 when it was set up, which was a philosophical discussion. It's amazing now when you think about Channel 4, it's awful. Called Modernity and its Discontents. Right? And it's a phrase that stuck with me, and I think that what the fascists do is they tap into the discontents of capitalism. And they say we can remove them, not by challenging the class basis of capitalism, but by displacing those discontents and projecting them on to racial minorities, the Jewish population, and so on. Right? So it's this reactionary fact, if we can just get rid of the Jews, society will work. And Rob's explained this really well. What I just want to also think about is part of why I think this is getting a wider echo. Because the fascists aren't simply building on removal of, anti-immigration, anti-refugee, so they're beginning to get some echo for some of this wider framework that we're talking. We had a very good meeting about conspiracy theories, that's something else as well there. And I think the second element, why it begins to get some echo, is a crisis of liberalism. And what I mean by this is, I think a lot of people look at society, and the heart of liberalism is the idea there is not an irreconcilable class contradiction at the heart of society. Society should be, harmonious, prosperous, where you get your just desserts. And people say, why isn't it working? Often projected back to sort of the post-war years, make America great. And people look for an explanation. And one of those explanations is to say, it should be harmonious, it should be prosperous, it should work. So some alien forces come along and poison the well, and we look for an explanation. Then you start to get the conspiracy theories, and so on. And that's why it's beginning to get some purchase beyond the traditional far right. They haven't necessarily hardened that up. But you can see the dangers of some of that classic worldview of the 30s getting a purchase in society. And therefore, part of our job, because there is another explanation. Our argument isn't society's wonderful, what do you want about? It's to offer an alternative explanation based on why class tensions deepen, because capitalism has been driven into crisis. And therefore, we organise on a class basis in response to that. And therefore, there's an ideological and political challenge, as well as direct opposition to the fascists, that is necessary if we want to make sure that those arguments don't get a bigger purchase in society.
Hello everyone, I'm Seth and I'm coming from Dundee. I'd like to thank Rob for giving such a rigorous education on this. There are many places in the SWP for these conversations, and there will always be more. But I'd like to say a little bit about how wedded our movement has been from its very creation to the fight against anti-Semitism. Right? So our founder, Tony Cliff, who was born Igal Gluckstein, right, was a Palestinian Jew, born in mandatory Palestine. Right? He fought his entire life against anti-Semitism. Right. It is the very nature of our organisation. Being an SWP member is to fight against anti-Semitism. It is what we are. And sometimes I feel like, not at a national level, but sometimes at branch level, we don't have enough spaces to properly educate against anti-Semitism. We do not give enough time to that. And I appreciate, personally, my branch, we have not done one in quite a long time. And I've been absolutely hunting for something, for a place to do it, because it's who we are. This is the foundation of us. We've always been fighting against anti-Semitism. And I would also like to say, if people have ever heard of a poem that starts, "First they came for the communists." Right? Now that poem was written by a German, Martin Niemöller. He was a little bit of a dodgy boy. But the poem itself goes through and finishes with, "Then they came for the Jews and then there was no one left for me." And that book that Donny Gluckstein wrote, The Radical Jewish Tradition, and another book called Revolutionary Yiddish Land that touches on the same points, makes that point that before our movement began to kick off, its roots are in Judaism in Europe. Truly it is. And to be honest, the Holocaust was an immense blow to socialism and communism, because the majority of the people who fundamentally pushed and believed in and held our movement were killed. Our movement is wedded to the fight against anti-Semitism.
I wanted to talk about the so-called gender-critical movement, the transphobic movement, which is really quite interesting, because anti-Semitism is at its core once you actually look at it in any sort of detail. Rob said, that individuals with individual Jews are targeted, and we see lots of stuff about Soros conspiracies. For the transphobic movement, I'm pretty sure most trans people didn't know anybody called Martin Rothblatt actually a few years ago, but the transphobic movement have picked her up as a Jewish trans woman, a philanthropist, and actually written a whole load of stuff from people who should know better, from people who say they're on the left fighting for women's rights, who say that Martin Rothblatt, who just happens to be Jewish, is a trans woman pushing transhumanism, coming for your children, coming for your women. You can see the sort of insidiousness of the anti-Semitism running through that, picked up by people who should know better, and then becomes a trope that's just accepted as part of a transphobic movement, reproduced in mainstream newspapers, the Times, the Telegraph, obviously the Mail, which, you know, the hurrah for the black shirt stuff has never really gone away for them, has it? But I do think it's incredibly insidious. And revolutionary socialists, I think, are in a unique position because we are the tribunes of the oppressed. We stand with trans people. We stand against anti-Semitism. We stand with Palestine, and none of those are contradictions. Now, sometimes those are going to be hard arguments, I think, but I think, you know, we're not activists. At the moment, it's pretty easy to be a Palestine activist, isn't it? You can go on a demo, you can march for Palestine. To be a revolutionary socialist means to take it further, to argue against the Tommy Robinson demo, to argue against anti-Semitism, to argue for Palestine, to argue for women's rights and for trans rights.
The point I want to make is the question of clarity in the argument. I think that Rob and others have made this point, that we have to be very, very precise in understanding anti-Semitism and what that means. The reason I say that is our enemies are ready to pounce at every mistake we make. Think about, for example, what happened to Ken Livingstone, in terms of he made a false understanding of the relationship between Hitler and Zionism in the 1930s. It wasn't anti-Semitic in itself, but it was a mistake that could be pounced on by enemies and used against us. That, I think, also, Corbyn, you know, didn't make that kind of mistake, but you can see there how that was weaponised. So also when you look at France, for example, Rob probably shocked people when he talked about two prominent Jewish activists, if you want to call them that, being prepared to vote for the Rassemblement National. We shouldn't really be surprised. If you look at actually the way in which the far left in France, particularly the leader of La France Insoumise, Mélenchon, has been accused of anti-Semitism, it's a way of trying to say this is the same extreme as the opposite side. Then, of course, what that means is when push comes to shove, and you prefer the system as it is to any challenge to it, you are then forced into that kind of position. That's what's happening in France. The final point I want to make is this. People have talked about how this, in a sense, tends to seep into our own movement. We, heard of our people, I think the comment in front talked about the WhatsApp group. We have the same thing where we are. And the thing is, I think the point I really want to make is, obviously we have to correct it, but the point I really want to make is this. If you do that, you ignore what the real enemy is, in other words, the imperialist system which uses Israel. It's not Israel running the system, and therefore you actually disable the ability to fight back. That's, I think, the real problem there. So I think the clarity that we have in terms of the way in which anti-system, the whole question fits into the global system is the important one in order to stop that kind of demoralisation and whatever the word is, you know what I mean? I think that's really the importance of the clarity of the argument, because it enables us to make the fight proper and a real one where we can win.
Yes, I just want to make one more point about the issue of these arguments creeping into our movement, the Palestine movement. I can just feel we've had a very successful, continue to have a very successful Palestine movement, and we've had to face this issue in very specific terms. And to some extent, we were quite lucky, because at one of our first big demonstrations, someone stepped up to the ground to make a speech, and made a speech, and actually it was full of awful stuff, and that we had to straight away confront the argument, discussion inside the movement, and start quite a vigorous debate discussion, which was very useful and helpful, and helped bring the argument, particularly by some of our own Jewish anti-Zionist comrades, and also in particular around the arguments around the scales of the Jewish mobilisations in the Palestine movement. This came to a head around the election campaign, because the candidate who was selected for the Galloway party in Chesterfield, an ex-Labour councillor, stood. And about 2 weeks into the campaign, the Daily Telegraph, obviously on the basis of a link, ran a story about her Twitter feed, which was full of filthy anti-Semitic. This isn't someone criticising Palestine being accused of being being pro-Palestinian, being accused of being anti-Semite. This was all sorts of stuff. Really, 6 million? Are we sure? That guy George Soros, children, aren't they involved in all that, every single filthy anti-Semitic trope? And that was quite useful. The fact we had to confront the argument early on in the movement meant that we could then take on the argument about whether she should be supported or not. We also had Donny come and speak on his book at one of our branch meetings, and got a couple of prominent members of the Palestine campaign, not our members, came along and actually had a very sharp argument. Actually, I thought Donny, at the time, I thought Donny had been a bit overly aggressive in the way he came back at this person who'd argued about the lobby. But actually, it was very, very useful, because when the issue of the Galloway candidate came up, we were able to put that argument, and that key individual was very influential inside our Palestine group, came along and agreed with us. The best outcome is come the election, she got 0.5% of the vote, which I think is pretty record. I think generally if you put George Galloway on your ticket in the middle of pro-Palestine, you'd expect to get a lot of votes. The fact we were able to carry out a systematic arguments on them, particularly on our 2 mosques, by the way, where she attempted to go and speak. We had arguments with the mosque leaderships to say she should not be allowed into your mosque. And because we've got good relationships with both the mosques over many, many years, they listened to us, they accepted our argument, she wasn't allowed to speak, and she was effectively isolated from the pro-Palestinian milieu when it came to the election. I think that's quite an important example of how you concretely try and take on some of these arguments inside the movement.
In the days after the murder of George Floyd, anti-Soros postings on Twitter escalated from 20,000 a day to 500,000 a day. Right? Now this isn't just some odd side phenomenon. Let me quote the former President of the United States, potentially the next President of the United States. He calls his political enemies vermin. We pledge to you that we will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country. This is a leader of the far right par excellence internationally, who constantly deploys attacks on Soros and other Jewish financial figures, and coded and not so coded language of great replacement, Muslim invaders, the migrant invasion. Sam and I watched the presidential debate. I don't know how many people watched all of it. Actually, I tell you what, it chilled me to the fucking bone. Why? Because every other minute, Trump returned to the migrants, not just migrants, criminals from prisons, rapists, 2 million of them, rapists, people from what he called mental institutions, killing thousands of our people. He didn't just say it once, he said it time and time again throughout the debate. Never once in that debate did the word racism pass across Biden's lips. I mean, I'm not quite sure what Biden was capable of, but never once, not from the moderators, and in all the post-debate analysis, I never heard the words, not when I was listening. It was all about his stumbling and his stuttering and all the rest of it, right? Now, you think about those quotes, you think about those figures on George Floyd and so on, and you think about 6th of January, multiply it by 10, multiply it by 100. You start to have a problem. That's the kind of danger we face. And I think that's our starting point, really, for the problems that arise on our side. You see, I'm for and I do. It's sometimes been quite exhausting exercise, or challenging anti-Semitism when it surfaces in the movement, on social media and so on. And we have to do it. I'll tell you what the most effective means of challenging that kind of political backwardness on our side. We've done it before. It's not new. It's struggle. You see, you have to use this stuff. When someone who's black starts to kind of slip into anti-Semitism, use the fact of George Floyd. We've got to get out and fight these bastards. You know, if someone's got prejudice towards trans people, then you use the common threat in order to forge unity, and you argue about the difference and the prejudice and the mistaken ideas in common struggle. It's the struggle that ultimately breaks down these things, and therefore it's crucial that we start from the threat. Then we move on to how we fight it, and the unity required to do so. And we face multiple enemies, don't we? We face the far-right populists like Farage and for Orban, and indeed Trump. We face the street movements like Tommy Robinson, and we face fascist parties and fascist organisations. Look, they overlap, don't they? They seep into each other, but they're also distinct in terms of the form of threat they pose and the kind of methods we need in order to mobilise against them. And really, finally, a couple of other things quickly. Germany. You see, it is horrific. I mean, I did a meeting, was it last year, 2 years ago, in Berlin for Marxism. The audience were great, but really, what's happening in Germany, the level of demonisation of the left, of Palestinians, and of anti-Zionist Jews. And I'll tell you what, you know what it reminds me of? The old trope at the heart of the anti-Semitic project. The left-wing Jew who's not loyal to their country, not loyal to the state, not loyal when it comes to the question of imperialist war, colonialism, and so forth. They're the real enemy. Churchill wrote a whole article about it in 1921, and it was common currency across the ruling classes of Europe in the 30s. I look at the Labour Party, and to be honest, I think there's a real animus towards left-wing Jews in the Labour Party. But I'll tell you something else about the Labour Party. You see, part of the reason that this kind of Zionist lobby, bought and paid for language and so on comes in, I'm sorry, we've got to learn a lesson from it. The Labour left thought they could go into Labour and turn it into a vehicle for social transformation. The problem was that it was always, reformism is always dominated by the right. Labour has always been pro-war, always been pro-Zionist. And what that meant was that a layer of people were disarmed, floundering around for an explanation of how it was they'd been defeated so catastrophically. And the good parts of the Labour left, which are the majority probably, they didn't slip into this stuff, but they didn't have an explanation against it. Because if you believe that the Labour Party is a vehicle, then you can't say it isn't. It's simple as that, really. Don't leave organised, I think, was the last gasp. I knew then they'd been defeated. If you want to fight the Labour right, you have to leave and organise, not stay in the trap, right? So just on that. On the other thing about Germany, though, I just want to say, I can accept, I think, that genuinely there is a whole layer of ordinary Germans, people, who have, if you like, this sense of guilt, if you want to call it. I don't believe that of the German state. I'm sorry. You know, for decades in my student years, and you look at 1968 and the student revolt, what was the driving force of the left in Germany? the bloody Nazification that still remained at the heart of the German state, the refusal to bring those Nazis, not only the refusal to bring them to trial, they were given high posts in the civil service, in government, in the state, in universities, in the education, in the police. Look at France, right? The chief of police in Paris, who was responsible for the roundup of French Jews under the Nazi occupation and sent 13,000 of them to the death camps, was the same chief of police who sent over 200 Algerians into the River Seine when they protested against for liberation and so forth. So don't tell me about these states feeling guilty. And I'll say there's something else about Germany. I think this is in part tied to the expansionist ambitions of the German state in terms of its own military, wanting to restore its own military might both in Europe and beyond. It's no accident that it's the second biggest funder after the US I'll finish with this. Look, unity. I want to finish with this. There's been a few references in meetings I've been to of a point that Adolf Hitler made about how his enemies could have understood how to break the Nazi movement at its origins. And they've been paraphrased. I want to just read it. Right? Only one danger could have jeopardized this development, the rise to power of the Nazi movement. If they had from the first day annihilated with the utmost brutality the nucleus of our new movement. Now this is a lesson from the ugly horse's mouth. But this is not just straightforward. You see, the word unity, well, who would disagree with it? Really. And it's important to unite all the forces who you have common ground with, who you agree with. But to face the fascist threat, to face the challenge that's rising in Europe and the United States, the key challenge for our side is whether we're going to be able to unite the forces who disagree. Not just over how you make a cup of tea, but over important questions of principle. How you unite them, but at the same time fight for revolutionary politics. You see, why is it that it's always a revolutionary organisation that's part of the United Front? I'm sorry, this is a fact. And it will always be true. Why? It's a paradox. It's a contradiction. If you are going to unite the trans activist, the black, the Muslim, the Jew, by the way, France is the biggest Jewish population, the biggest Muslim population in Western Europe. If you're going to unite all those forces, it requires a force that supports all those struggles on principle, that has a revolutionary vision of liberation from oppression and exploitation, in order to argue that across those differences unite, plus an understanding of the enemy as we've discussed today, plus an understanding of the enemy and of the future of hope that is required, the hope that is required in terms of the struggles to change society. And that's why we need to build revolutionary organisation. And I will say to anyone who's not a member, join. Because the challenge is high. We face real challenges and it makes a difference. It can make a difference in a workplace, in a university, and it can make a difference in the movement, whether we win or lose, and how big we are. Thanks.